Today, pizza is almost impossible to escape. In the United States, it can be delivered to your door, served at sporting events, bought frozen from a supermarket, or made in restaurants ranging from small neighborhood shops to enormous chains. But the pizza we recognize today did not appear overnight. Its story begins long before pepperoni, mozzarella, delivery boxes, and giant American pizza chains. And surprisingly, the person who invented pizza is not known. For thousands of years, people in different parts of the world had been making simple flatbreads. Ancient Mediterranean cultures cooked breads that could be eaten with other foods, and the Romans developed their own forms of baked flatbread. These foods were related to the broader tradition that eventually influenced pizza, but they were not the modern pizza we know today. The important transformation happened in Naples. By the 18th century, Naples had developed a distinctive street food culture. Pizza became associated with ordinary working people because it was relatively inexpensive, filling, and could be eaten quickly. Historical accounts describe pizza as a food deeply connected with the poorer neighborhoods of Naples. That matters because pizza was never originally designed as luxury cuisine. It was practical food. People who worked long hours did not necessarily have the money, time, or kitchen facilities needed for elaborate meals. A piece of baked dough topped with inexpensive ingredients could provide something hot and satisfying without requiring a formal dining room. And this is where the story becomes much more interesting. Because the pizza that eventually conquered America and became one of the world's most recognizable foods was first shaped by a city where food, poverty, work, and street life were closely connected. Naples did not simply give the world a recipe. It created the environment in which pizza could evolve. And the next stage of that evolution would depend on one ingredient that had arrived in Europe from an entirely different continent. But why would a fruit from the Americas eventually become one of the defining ingredients of Italian pizza? That is where the story takes its next surprising turn. Before tomato sauce became almost inseparable from pizza, tomatoes had a surprisingly complicated reputation in Europe. The tomato originated in the Americas and reached Europe after the Spanish conquest of the New World. By the 16th century, European botanists were documenting the unfamiliar plant. In 1544, the Italian herbalist Pietro Andrea Mattioli described tomatoes and associated them with plants in the nightshade family. That association mattered. Some members of the nightshade family are poisonous, and the tomato was therefore viewed with suspicion in parts of Europe. Over time, the fruit developed an unfortunate reputation. It was grown as an unusual plant and was not immediately accepted as an everyday food. There is also a famous story claiming that wealthy Europeans became sick after eating tomatoes because acidic tomato juice supposedly reacted with lead in pewter plates. But this explanation should be treated carefully. The idea has been repeated for years, but historians have questioned whether it actually explains the tomato's reputation. What is much better documented is that people genuinely regarded the tomato with suspicion, partly because of its botanical relationship to plants considered dangerous. Then something changed in southern Italy. Tomatoes found a climate where they could grow successfully, and gradually they became part of local cooking. By the late 18th century, tomato-based preparations were becoming increasingly important in Naples. And this created a remarkable combination. Naples already had a cheap flatbread culture. Now there was an inexpensive ingredient that could be spread across that bread. Official European documentation on pizza Napolitana places its early development in the period around 1715 to 1725 and specifically records tomato being used to season pizza. The result was not a royal invention. It was a food evolving through everyday cooking. Garlic, oil, herbs, and tomatoes could transform simple dough without requiring expensive meat or elaborate preparation. One early Neapolitan style, marinara, became associated with tomato, garlic, oregano, and oil. Pizza was becoming something recognizable. But it still had a long way to go before it could become America's favorite slice. Because in Naples, pizza was still primarily a food of the streets, and the people eating it had developed an ingenious way to carry a hot pizza without even needing a plate. And that simple trick would reveal just how deeply pizza was connected to the daily lives of ordinary Neapolitans. By the late 18th and early 19th centuries, pizza was becoming deeply connected with everyday life in Naples. But there was one problem. A working person did not always have the time, or the money, to sit down for a meal. So pizza adapted to the street. One of the most distinctive examples was pizza a portafolio, literally, wallet pizza. The name comes from the way the pizza is folded, first in half and then again, creating a compact package that can be held in one hand. Italian tourism authorities still describe it as a traditional takeaway form designed to be eaten while walking through Naples. The idea sounds simple, but it tells us something important about the people who ate it. Pizza was not necessarily a meal that required a table, a knife, and a fork. It could be bought, folded, carried, and eaten immediately. Historical descriptions show that pizza sellers were already operating in Naples long before modern delivery restaurants existed. In the 19th century, vendors could sell pizzas directly from shops or from mobile stands, bringing inexpensive food closer to people working in the streets. And the business was growing. A census from 1807 recorded 55 pizzerias in Naples. Later in the century, the number had increased substantially. This is one of the clearest signs that pizza had moved beyond being an occasional food. It had become an established trade. The people making it were known as pizzaiuoli, and historical documents show that pizza making was already recognized as a distinct occupation around the turn of the 19th century. But pizza was still far from the polished dish many Americans know today. Descriptions from the period show a surprisingly wide range of toppings. Tomatoes, cheese, garlic, oil, herbs, fish, lard, and other inexpensive ingredients could appear depending on what was available and affordable. In other words, there was no single universal pizza. There was a basic idea, and countless local variations. And then Naples reached another turning point. Pizza had already become popular among ordinary people, but it was about to acquire a new reputation, a new symbol, and eventually a story that would be repeated around the world. Because one pizza would soon become famous as the dish created for a queen, and the truth behind that story is far more complicated than the legend suggests. By the middle of the 19th century, pizza was no longer an obscure food known only to a few streets in Naples. Historical descriptions show that pizzas could be topped with tomatoes, cheese, herbs, garlic, oil, and other ingredients. In fact, a record from the 1850s describes combinations that look remarkably similar to what we would later call a margherita pizza. Then came one of the most famous stories in pizza history. The year was 1889. Italy had been unified for only a few decades, and the country was still developing a shared national identity. That year, King Umberto I and Queen Margherita of Savoy visited Naples. According to the traditional story, a Neapolitan pizzaiolo named Raffaele Esposito prepared pizzas for the Queen. One version of the story says that he created a pizza using 3 ingredients whose colors matched the Italian flag: red tomato, white mozzarella, and green basil. The pizza was supposedly named Margherita, after the Queen. It is a perfect story. A famous queen. A humble street food. And a dish transformed into a symbol of Italy. But there is a problem. The story of Margherita's invention is not as straightforward as generations of retellings have suggested. Italy's official tourism website itself describes the 1889 invention story as a legend. Historical evidence shows that pizzas combining tomato, mozzarella, and basil were already being prepared in Naples decades before the Queen's visit. Francesco de Burchard's 1853 work described tomato pizza with slices of mozzarella arranged in the shape of a flower. So Esposito almost certainly did not invent the basic combination from nothing. What may have happened in 1889 is different. The visit could have helped attach the Queen's name to an already existing style of Neapolitan pizza, turning it into a memorable story that survived for generations. That distinction matters. Because history is often shaped not only by what was invented, but by which version of the story people chose to remember. And while the margarita legend helped elevate pizza's reputation, another force was about to carry Neapolitan pizza far beyond Italy. Thousands of Italians were leaving their homeland and crossing the Atlantic. Among them were Neapolitans carrying something more valuable than a recipe. They were carrying a taste of home. And when that taste reached New York, pizza was about to become something America had never seen before. By the late 19th century, pizza had become deeply rooted in Naples. But its next transformation would happen thousands of miles away. As Italian immigrants arrived in the United States, many settled in cities such as New York, where large Italian communities developed. Among them were immigrants from Campania, the region that includes Naples. They brought familiar foods, cooking traditions, and the memory of Neapolitan pizza with them. At first, pizza remained strongly connected to Italian-American neighborhoods. It was not yet the nationwide American food we recognize today. And the early history is more complicated than the famous story usually suggests. For decades, Gennaro Lombardi was widely credited with opening America's first pizzeria in New York in 1905. His restaurant, Lombardi's, became one of the most famous names in American pizza history. But researchers later uncovered evidence that challenges the traditional story. Pizza historian Peter Regis found newspaper advertisements and other historical records indicating that pizza businesses existed in New York before Lombardi's supposed 1905 opening. One important figure was Filippo Milone, an Italian baker who appears to have established several early pizza businesses in Manhattan and Brooklyn. One advertisement from 1903 promoted a Neapolitan pizzeria in Manhattan. Even more interesting, records indicate that the business at 53 1/2 Spring Street, later associated with Lombardi's, was already operating under another proprietor before Lombardi arrived in America. Regis's research suggests Lombardi first entered the United States in 1904, at 17, and may initially have worked there rather than founded the establishment himself. So who deserves the title of America's first pizza maker? There is no completely settled answer. What the evidence does show is that pizza had reached American cities through Italian immigration before it became a mainstream American food. And once it was here, it began changing. American customers wanted larger portions. Different cheeses and ingredients became common. Coal-fired ovens helped create a distinctive New York style, while pizzerias gradually expanded beyond Italian neighborhoods. Pizza was no longer simply something immigrants had brought from Naples. It was becoming an American food. But the biggest transformation was still ahead. Because once pizza escaped the boundaries of immigrant neighborhoods, America was about to turn one traditional Neapolitan dish into an enormous national industry. For decades, pizza in America was closely associated with Italian-American neighborhoods. Then, after World War II, something changed. Americans who had encountered pizza while serving or traveling overseas helped increase interest in the food. At the same time, pizza was spreading beyond the communities where Italian immigrants had originally introduced it. Historians describe the post-war period as a major turning point in pizza's transformation from an ethnic specialty into a mainstream American food. And America had the perfect environment for that transformation. Suburbs were expanding. Cars were becoming central to everyday life. Supermarkets and home freezers were becoming more common, while Americans increasingly wanted foods that were convenient and easy to prepare. Pizza fit that new lifestyle remarkably well. But convenience created a new challenge. Traditional pizza was made fresh and eaten immediately. Frozen pizza had to survive storage, transportation, and reheating without turning into a soggy mess. By the late 1950s, frozen pizza was emerging as a commercial product, forcing manufacturers to rethink how the dough, sauce, and cheese worked together. At the same time, another revolution was taking place in restaurants. In 1958, brothers Dan and Frank Carney opened the first Pizza Hut in Wichita, Kansas. 2 years later, Tom and James Monahan began what would become Domino's in Michigan. These businesses represented something fundamentally different from the small neighborhood pizzeria. Pizza could now be standardized. The dough could be portioned. The toppings could be measured. The cooking process could be repeated. And eventually, the entire experience could be scaled across hundreds or thousands of locations. That changed the meaning of pizza. It was no longer only a food prepared by an individual pizzaiolo for people living nearby. It was becoming a product that could be produced quickly, sold consistently, transported efficiently, and marketed to an enormous audience. Domino's, for example, began with a single Michigan location in 1960 and expanded through franchising during the following decades. Pizza had crossed another invisible boundary. It had gone from street food, to immigrant food, to American mainstream food, and now to an international business. But commercialization did not erase pizza's regional identity. Instead, America created its own versions: New York slices, Chicago deep dish, frozen supermarket pizza, fast food pizza, and countless local styles. And then something even bigger happened. Pizza stopped belonging to one city or even one country. It became a global language of food, and the final chapter of its story would take it far beyond the streets of Naples. Pizza's journey did not end when it crossed the Atlantic. In many ways, that was only the beginning. A food that had developed in Naples gradually became part of different cultures around the world. Each place adapted it to local tastes, ingredients, cooking methods, and eating habits. In America, pizza developed into regional styles that became famous in their own right. New York's large, foldable slices became an American icon, while Chicago developed its own deep dish tradition. Later, frozen pizzas, restaurant chains, delivery services, and countless independent pizzerias made pizza accessible to an even larger audience. But something important survived beneath all those variations. The basic idea remained remarkably simple: dough, heat, and ingredients transformed into a meal that could be shared. And the original Neapolitan tradition is still alive. UNESCO recognized the art of the Neapolitan pizzaiuolo as intangible cultural heritage in 2017. The organization describes pizza making as a culinary practice passed between generations, involving specific skills in preparing, shaping, topping, and baking the dough. That recognition is significant because pizza's history was never really about one inventor. There is no universally accepted person who can be credited with creating pizza. Instead, its history is a story of gradual development. Flatbreads existed for centuries. Naples developed its own street food culture. Tomatoes became part of local cooking. Pizzaiuoli refined their craft. Immigrants carried the food across borders. American businesses transformed it into a mass-market product. And then the world made pizza its own. Today, you can find pizza almost anywhere, from traditional Neapolitan pizzerias to American delivery chains and restaurants creating completely new combinations. The irony is that a food once associated with the poorer streets of Naples eventually became one of the most recognizable foods on the planet. Its history contains poverty, migration, innovation, disputed legends, entrepreneurship, and cultural exchange. But perhaps the most fascinating part is this. Pizza survived because it was adaptable. It could change without completely losing its identity. From a simple meal in Naples to a global industry, pizza became much more than a recipe. It became a piece of cultural history that millions of people continue to recreate every day. And that is where our journey ends, not with the invention of pizza, because there was no single inventor, but with the remarkable transformation of an ordinary food into a global tradition. If you enjoyed this journey through the hidden history of pizza, subscribe to the final chapter for more stories about the surprising history behind the things we see every day. Because sometimes, the food sitting on your table has a history far more complicated than you ever imagined. And the next story may be hiding in plain sight.